I'm recording my homily for the 10th Sunday of Ordinary Time in 2018. Next Sunday would be obviously the 11th, but we have a special celebration coming up, which is the feast day of the Nativity of St. John the Baptist. And so we'll be getting ready for that for next weekend. This last weekend was Father's Day, and so my homily was really a lot on Father's Day. I only took one theme from the first reading in the Gospel. And so in the first reading in the Gospel, the first reading has an example of how the cedar tree, we have lots of cedar trees here in the Northwest. This would have been a Lebanon cedar, though the cedar trees in Lebanon are different, but they're equally as majestic. They're incredibly thick. They're very strong trees. And so they use the tree as an example of stability, right? So what do you do when your hillside is not very stable? You plant trees into it, right? So they can grow really deep and give it stability. Well, the cedar tree, very large tree, is very strong and provides stability to the land, to the area, right? In the reading, it talks about how it also, though, provides protection. It provides protection, for the little birds. So the birds come in and nest in its branches, and it's a place for them to rest. It's a place of security. So really what it's describing is that the cedar tree is also, it's a home. And so a home provides security, it provides stability, it provides a place to rest. And I think these are beautiful examples of a home, but also of fatherhood, okay? Now, in fatherhood, there are attributes to fatherhood that are not mutually exclusive from motherhood. There are attributes, there are virtues of a good father that are also equally of a good mother. But there are also some differences. And the differences that I want to talk about is how men are called to show love. In some ways, it's going to be very similar to how women are called to show love, but in other ways, they're going to be different. It's just the similarities and the differences between us as men and women, okay? So all men, whether they have biological children or not, all men are going to be called to love in a fatherly way. It's just how we are. It's how God created us. It's beautiful. And then grace, faith, builds on that, so that it becomes supernaturally fatherly, right? And equally of women, all women, whether they have biological children or not, are called to love in a motherly way. And that love is also elevated by God's grace to be something supernatural. Okay, in the gospel, Jesus takes this whole example and just retells it, but with the mustard seed. And he expounds on it by talking about how small a mustard seed is, and how big of a bush or a tree the mustard tree becomes, that also provides stability and safety and security. Okay, so for us as men, there is an attribute, there is a intrinsic desire for us to provide protection. We want to protect. We want to protect the children around us. We want to protect our families. We want to protect our communities. There is a desire, and that's natural, right? That's not necessarily something that someone who of faith, someone needs. Let me back up. It's not something, someone doesn't have to have faith in order to have that desire. It comes to us as men just naturally. The desire to protect. Now, when I talk about protect, I don't mean kind of in that macho way where, it's like dad sitting on the porch with a shotgun when some young man comes to date his daughter, okay? I'm not necessarily talking about that kind, or dad stays up all night to protect the family. I'm not talking about that, okay? I'm talking about how a man is called to love in a fatherly way. So a fatherly love is going to intrinsically desire to have a home that's peaceful, that's secure, but also where the children and the wife feel secure in themselves. In other words, the children grow up to be self-confident in a good way because they've been loved, because dad loved them, because dad was present, because dad wanted to be part of their life and to be really and truly just that fatherly person. And I'm going to get at some of the attributes of that in a little bit. Okay, I'm going to back up just a little bit because I don't want to say we're at a battle. Maybe we're in a battle. It's not that necessarily there's anything that threatens us as men per se, because the biggest threat to us as men is really ourself in not living our fatherliness or not loving the way we should love. The biggest obstacle to that is really ourself. But there are things in our culture too that either help build it up or don't. When I was growing up, I don't watch TV anymore. And it's not because I'm super disciplined, it's because I love TV. And if I have cable, if I have satellite, I will watch way too much TV. And so I don't. I do watch movies, okay? But when I did watch TV, when I was much younger, you look at the sitcoms, the shows that are often meant to be humorous, right? And you look at how men are portrayed. How are men portrayed? So I'm going back to like the 1980s, right? The 1980s, 1990s. And it was, I'll give you one example. It's a bunch of guys sitting around a bar all day. And they're just dumb as rocks. I mean, they are not the all-stars on any level. And I suppose that's what makes it kind of funny. Maybe we're laughing at ourselves, I don't know. But still, the portrayal of men on no level in this entire sitcom was dad is a truly loving leader. That he's a person in the family who shares leadership with the mom, and he's equally responsible, he's diligent, he's kind, he's courageous. You don't get a sense of any of that. You get a sense that they're just really kind of dumb. And I suppose that's what makes it funny. Now, there's other sitcoms where I think men were portrayed as being equally dumb. There was one really, really horrible sitcom. I think, what was it called? It's like Married with Children or something, where the dad was just the most horrible example of a dad. And again, that's kind of what made it funny, I suppose. The cartoon, The Simpsons. The Simpsons' dad is just dumb. I mean, he epitomizes just dumbness, right? And again, that's what kind of makes it funny. But if somebody doesn't have a truly heroic example of fatherliness in their life, where are they going to see it? Are they going to see it in their priests? Are they going to see it in their coach? Are they going to see it in their teachers? Are there any, male role models in their life? Uncles? Dad? In the drama shows, men were better. They were better. They were portrayed at least usually as being somewhat courageous and somewhat intelligent. But very rarely did you ever have men being portrayed that, but also doing all of that because of that which was closest to their heart, and that was their wife, their children. In other words, everything they're doing is to be that cedar tree, to be protective, to provide stability. And so just very rarely did you see that example. I felt like when I entered the seminary, I had the example of my dad and my brothers, and some other men were good examples to me. But the one area in my life where I just felt like I was just totally incompetent was knowing how to be, in a good spiritual way, how to be a leader, how to be a good man who's a good spiritual leader. I just felt completely incompetent in how to do that. So anyways, okay, so there are some obstacles in our culture. A couple years ago, I was a chaplain of a Courage group. So Courage is a kind of a support group for men and women who struggle with same-sex attraction, right? Our culture calls that gay or lesbian. They refused to use those labels because they didn't want to be labeled. They didn't want to have their humanity reduced down just to the sexual preference or practice or orientation. But what I loved about the group was they would first see themselves as sons and daughters of God. They truly desired a relationship with their Heavenly Father, right? One of the things that often came out, though, was that many of them in their stories, in their history, you realize very quickly that many of them, I'd say most of them, if not all of them that I encountered, had very poor relationships with their dads. Whether it was good and ended bad, or was non-existent, or just was bad all the time, we can't downplay the importance, the role of an example in our lives, and how we become, especially for us as men. And we're looking at Father's Day, how we can become really good fathers, really good fatherly men. When I say all this, I hope there's no women who are thinking that I'm somehow downplaying their role. Not at all. Again, I'm going to get to some of that in a second. But here's the thing. When we as men fail, the consequences are disastrous. I mean, it is so horrible when we as men fail. We not only go from becoming what we should be as protectors, right? Again, I'm not saying protectors as top down, but protectors as just our role. We not only not protect, and so you have that cedar tree, that home begin to become more vulnerable and less stable, but we begin to become the perpetrators. We begin to become the predators. We begin to become the ones who actually destroy. I mean, look at our prison system. Most crime, especially most violent crime that happens in our world, happens by us as men. When we lose our fatherliness, we become the opposite. We become really, really bad. Most of the sexual abuse, most of the sexual assaults that happen, which again I think is the worst crime in the world, most of it is perpetrated by men. And so just how disastrous it becomes when we lose our true identity, we forget to be who God wants us to be. I have a priest friend who, it was a couple years ago, but or a little while back, he was telling me, he says he hopes that one day us as men, and he was including the Pope, the bishops, the priests, deacons, fathers, dads, single, bachelors, just all of us as men, he says, and women as well. But he's saying he hopes one day we will stop inflicting our fatherly wounds on each other. In other words, we all have some wounds in our life that go back to when we were very young, whether we were our fathers were just emotionally distant, or whether we just didn't receive something we needed to receive, or maybe there was even abuse, that when we have that, we begin to then, because of those wounds, we inflict the damage on the subsequent generation. In other words, if there's someone who grows up in an emotionally distant home, he doesn't learn how to be a good father from his dad, and so then when he becomes a father, he kind of does the same thing. Now that's not always true. It's not always true, okay? But if you look at how a lot of our narcissism, our insecurities, they often go back to when we should have learned how to be secure, the cedar tree, but something was lacking. All right. This last week we had a meeting with all the priests, and we do it once a year. We get together for about 4 days, and we usually have somebody give some talks. And this year the talks were pretty heavy. I talked about this at my. I'm sorry, I'm getting distracted. There's an eagle flying right over me. It's actually quite beautiful, and he's distracting me. So where was I? Yes, we had a talk. So the talks were quite heavy. They were really, really good, though. I mentioned them on Father's Day when I was talking about these themes that we were going to be having this talk in, so we've already had them. We had this priest come, and so what he talked about was pornography and the destruction that it's causing to us as men, but to our brothers, and it's also not just men. Men aren't the only ones struggling with this, but men are definitely struggling with it. It is very destructive. And so these talks were really good. And so it just brought out once again that when whatever the circumstance, whenever we begin to fall into addictions and things, it just goes really, really bad. It just goes really bad. Some people will probably be tempted to say pornography is not that bad, it's natural, it's a sexual outlet. It is horrific, the damage that it inflicts. We had another talk given by some people who are experts in the field of counseling and also just a study of the brain. And they talked about just what this addiction, what pornography does to the brain when somebody becomes addicted to it. And it was really interesting to see how the brain actually changes itself and how it works when it is in the midst of addictive behavior, especially with regards to this particular addiction, where the higher functioning of the brain, the cortex, the higher functioning, actually begins to die. It begins to become far less active, and the lower functions of the brain take over. And so the object to get somebody out of that addiction is to get them back up into the higher functions of the brain where they can rationally process these. Anyways, sorry, I'm getting off track. But suffice it to say, when we as men go bad, we really go bad. We become, instead of being the protector, we become the predator, right? All right. We all struggle with weaknesses, and so again, I'm going to get at some of the solutions here in a second. Okay, I have a priest friend not from this diocese, and he was telling me how there was a priest in his diocese who was struggling with some mental issues. He was going through kind of a nervous breakdown, and so they eventually removed him from his parish. But then the diocese told the parishioners that there's just a boat going by playing music. Sorry, I get distracted easy. What was I talking about? Yeah, so the diocese told the parishioners that this priest was going away for further studies, right? That sounds honorable, that's a good thing. But what's frustrating is, why couldn't the diocese just be honest? Why couldn't they just tell the people, he's having a breakdown, he's really struggling, pray for him. And so whenever a father can't be honest, can't be himself, can't be honest with his children, trust is broken, right? So trust gets broken, and deeper, darker secrets begin to form. And so sometimes we need help. And so one of the first things I want to talk about for us as men is that we need each other. We need to be strengthened by each other. We need to have good, healthy, fraternal relationships. And that doesn't mean, some fraternal group that just goes and gets drunk when they get together. That's not healthy. I mean really good spiritual men who support each other. And where there's the ability to be vulnerable in that, and also to trust each other and support each other. That's very, very important. But also to be able to do that with our children and with wives and in the family, where there is true honesty, authentic honesty and humility, so that we as men can always become better and better. And I know it's hard. It is really hard. But to pray for it, right? To pray for that humility, to have that honesty. I was reading a book, I just go a little bit deeper with this. I was reading a book a while back, I think I mentioned it, on Wanda Poltowska. I think that's how you say her name. She was a collaborator in the resistance against Nazism in Poland. She was a Polish part of the resistance. She was caught, she was imprisoned, and she was in an internment camp for about 4 years until the war finally ended. This is World War II. And the story is predominantly her telling of what it was like to be in this internment camp. And it is horrible. You may never have heard of this camp by name, but you probably heard of what became known about this camp. And that was where they did a lot of medical experimentation on the inmates. This camp was completely women. It was all women. But they did medical experimentation on them. And when you hear her describe what these women went through, it is gut-wrenching, it is horrible. But for me, when I was reading the book, it didn't make me cry. It didn't make me really just cringe as a man until she started to recount what happened to her once the soldiers left and once they were freed, right? So at the end of the war, the guards just left. They were fleeing for their lives because the Allied soldiers were coming in and taking over Germany. And so there's just this day when they're just like, no more guards, and they can just leave. Well, so this group of women is like, well, what do we do? I mean, we got to get home. So they just start walking home. There was no other way for them to get home. Well, as they start going home, they start encountering all these soldiers who've come through, right? And every once in a while, soldiers will offer to give them a ride. But every time that happened, the soldiers were just trying to get these women alone so they could take advantage of them. And now, because I'm on video, I didn't use this word when I was giving my homily in the parish, but these men were really just taking them somewhere where they could rape them. And I'm reading this, and it just breaks my heart, because these are the soldiers who were come to liberate them, to free them, to protect them, to save them, right? But they couldn't save them from themselves. And so instead of being the protector, they became the predator. And this story is time after time, they encounter situations where they have to flee for their lives, basically, because of what some of these soldiers were wanting to do and trying to do. So eventually, this group of young women, they just had to avoid all towns, all cities. They had to stay away from the roads. They just had to basically go through the countryside because of these men who were supposed to be protective, who were supposed to be helping. So what are some qualities that we as men constantly need to be trying to grow in? The first is purity. Purity. So if somebody asks, what is purity? Purity is the ability to love someone for the sake of themselves, for the sake of that person. I love this person for their sake. I love them because I want to protect them. I want to help them. I want to bring peace into their life. I want to bring joy into their life. And so it's the opposite of I want to get something. I want something from them. And so our pornographic generation is I want to objectify this person for myself, right? Now, some other day, I'm going to go deeper into the things that go on in our hearts when we start entering into those ways of thinking, how we actually fall into that, but I'm not going to do that today. Purity. Pray for it every day. Pray for purity. Doesn't matter if you're married or not married, pray for it so that we can be the cedar tree in the community. We can be strength. We can be protectors rather than predators, right? Purity is very important. They said in our talk that pornography has become the number one reason for a divorce. I don't know where they got that survey. I don't know where they got that fact from, but that's what they said. I don't know if it is number one, but I'm sure it's pretty high on the list. All right? Become the protector, not the predator. Spiritual leadership is the other thing. So if we have purity, we also need spiritual leadership. And so what I implore dads, do not saddle your wife with the leadership of the family in terms of spiritual issues. Share it with her. Be a team. Work together. Be spiritual leaders together. Be a tag team. Carry that responsibility with your wife. Do not just dump it on her. If that happens, we as men destroy the faith of our children because they need the man to share in that spiritual leadership. Pray with your wife every day. Pray with her every day. Pray with your kids. Pray as a family, right? And set a really good example of sacramental life, of love of Jesus. If you're in love with Jesus and you show it with your children, it's amazing how that impacts them. purity and spiritual leadership. And the other thing is, again, I guess it ties in with spiritual leadership, but be a good example. Be a good example so that your kids learn how to relate to men in a healthy way. Oftentimes, when teenagers are not close to their dads, they become very promiscuous and they engage in a lot of high-risk behavior. Teenage girls often look at their dad as how to relate to men in a healthy way, in a non-sexual way, right? Because the sexual part will just naturally come when they're looking for a husband. But to learn how to be able to relate and have good self-dignity and self-esteem so that they can form relationships in healthy ways, right? Especially when they encounter a predator, someone who's not going to necessarily have their best intentions in their heart. And so to give them the quality, so they learn that from their dad. Young men learn how to be the protector rather than the predator. They learn how to do that from the dad, because our world is not going to help them, right? All right. I'm probably going to be going back to this theme, maybe not next week, but in the future, just to go a little bit deeper in some of the issues. And so I implore, let's be good fatherly men and support women who are being good motherly women, and as a team to watch how God works. All right, God bless.